Hey guys, Slashoom here, and I'm going to share with you today a Death Knight tanking guide for Wrath of the Lich King Classic. This is going to walk through everything you would need to know for raid tanking and heroic dungeon tanking, and ultimately at the end of this guide you should have the confidence to step into those scenarios and know what you need to be doing as a Death Knight and how to tank. And if you're interested in more information on this or you want to ask some questions, you're welcome to jump into the Discord. That's at slashoom.tv/discord, or you can always watch me stream live on Twitch at twitch.tv/slashoom and ask me any questions you have or reach out to me in those two ways. So let's get started, and I'll walk you through kind of what we're going to talk about today and get you set up with tanking on a Death Knight. Just a quick overview what we're going to go through today. Just some basic things that you need to know about tanking on a Death Knight. We'll go over some talents. There's a lot of different talent trees and glyph setups. We'll talk about the different rotations that you're going to use with those specs. And then we'll talk about what's kind of best in a raid tanking scenario, and then what works best for heroic dungeon tanking. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with just some additional quick tips to kind of help you out and get you on your way tanking. And definitely stick around to the end, because I'm going to talk about one-handed weapons versus two-handed weapons and how to know which one's best for you. And I know there's always been a lot of talk about that, a lot of questions around that. So there's a ton of weapons in Axe, and a lot of them are contested, so we'll just talk about weapons and figure out what's best for you. What we're not going to cover in this guide is unholy tanking, playable races, professions, and enchants and gemming and all that stuff. As far as unholy tanking goes, I know there are some people who are big proponents of it, and this is fine. I would actually encourage you to experiment, encourage you to try new things. I definitely love the experimental mindset, and I try a lot of new things myself. There's some scenarios where I just want to use proven things, and a lot of times in the raid taking scenario, that's what you want to go with. So I'm not a big fan of unholy personally. Again, if you're really interested in that, you can definitely try it. I would just let your healers know, let your raid team know that you're trying something new, or maybe try it in a dungeon first. That's a lot of time where I like to do my experimenting, because there's a lot less chance of a failure in a raid environment if something does go wrong. So all that being said, we're not going to cover unholy tanking, but if you're interested in that, there are some resources for that you can look into. As far as playable races and professions, you've probably already chosen these, but if you need to know biz professions, it's engineering and jewel crafting, and then your enchants and things are going to, it's pretty standard, but it's going to change depending on what your gearing is, so most of the time you're just going to go for the most stamina. Okay, so let's just talk about some basic tips that to help you get started. Your two main priorities as a Death Knight tank is, and pretty much any tank, is staying alive and building and maintaining threat. Those are your jobs. Don't die and build and maintain threat. So you're managing your cooldowns properly, and you're just pumping threat so that your DPS can pump harder. Very far down is your third priority, which is doing damage, and it's really just not that important as a tank. In fact, all of the other tanks generally do more damage than a Death Knight tank. I know you might want to bang, and I'll let you bang.
Let me bang, man. I want to do that, man. Let me bang, bro. I do.
I'm going to tell you how you can bang. There's a spec for that, but in general, we do pretty poor DPS compared to the other tanks. And in general, if you're looking to be in a speedrunning guild and things like that, they're probably not going to go with a Death Knight tank. They're going to want to go with probably like a prop paladin and a bear tank and stuff like that, because they're going to be able to do more damage. So damage really isn't that important. Okay, so your stat priority is going to be hitting defense cap. That's pretty much the main thing with any tank, and that makes you uncrittable in PvE scenarios, and so you do that by achieving 540 defense. This equates to 689 defense rating, and then once you're defense capped, again, you can't be crit, so that's your first priority, is becoming uncrittable. Definitely in a raid environment. As far as dungeons go, you can totally go into dungeons without being crit capped. You're going to get hit a little bit harder, maybe let the healer know, especially if they're new or under geared, but heroics are kind of a joke, so it's not a big deal. You can also use resilience in conjunction with defense rating to hit that crit cap. There are useful spreadsheets and useful weak ores for that. That's all on my Discord. If you're interested in that, you can slide in there. Just know that if you are stacking a lot of resilience, because I did see tanks doing this early on, they would grab a bunch of PvP pieces with resilience and think they're good to go. You will have less avoidance, because defense does contribute to your dodge rating and your parry rating, which is going to make you dodge and parry the boss more. they're going to be doing less damage. So just know that you're going to be a little squishier. We're already squishy enough as it is, so I wouldn't recommend stacking a bunch of resilience to hit that crit cap. A little bit's fine, but just don't go overboard with it. Your next big stats are stamina and then armor, and I would say it's really just stamina. So that's your most important one. After you hit your defense cap, you're just stacking stam. That means you're gemming stam, enchanting stam, as much stam as you can get. Armor is also useful because it contributes to what's kind of called your effective health pool. But that has diminishing returns after it hits 75%. So you're like, okay, what the heck does all that mean? And you probably heard some of these terms before if you're newer to tanking. But your effective health pool, there's a way to calculate that, and it's essentially, you know, taking your damage reduction and your health and then making a value of that based on like how much the boss is like gonna be hitting you and things like that. And your armor mitigation goes into that as well. So just know that I don't think we're gonna have this problem this phase, but you know, in general, you're going to be taking the gear that has the most amount of stamina on it, and armor's just going to come along, you know, with it. So you're never going to be like choosing a piece because it has more or less armor and worried about hitting your armor cap. Eventually, as we go on and the gear gets stronger, we are probably going to hit armor cap. And basically what that means is that after 75%, any more armor that you get is really not worth it, okay? Because you'd want those stats to be somewhere else. So essentially, the diminishing return means it's just not, you're not getting the bang for the buck, okay? Next would be your avoidance. That's where you get your dodge and your parry and your miss, and we'll talk about where you get some of that. And then for Death Knights, mitigation is all armor. We don't have a shield like prot paladins and prot warriors, and they've got their block values, which contributes to their mitigation. For us, it's just armor. So again, you don't really need to worry about this, but just for future reference and a little bit of overkill knowledge there. Next stats are strength, agility, dodge, and parry. So you're gonna see dodge stat, you're gonna see parry stats on gear. You're not really gonna be looking to get these stats. They're just going to come on the gear that you're gonna be getting anyway, because they're gonna have defense. Some will have extra dodge, some will have extra parry. So if you're trying to figure out which piece is better, generally you want to go with item level. Item level is better than all. And of course stamina. Whatever has more stam and item level, as long as you're keeping your defense cap. The dodge and parry and all that's going to come along for the ride. It's nice if there's things with strength at this point. You know, again, this content's very easy. So if you're like, hey, I like this piece, it has more strength, I'm going to be doing a little bit more damage, more threat, whatever. It's totally fine. You're going to get dodge from your dodge rating, your defense rating, and you'll get some from agility. You'll get parry from parry rating, defense rating, and strength. So defense rating is always good to have. You're going to get extra avoidance from it. These aren't sets you're really necessarily going for. They're just going to come on the gear. Default to stamina, default to item level. Really don't have to worry about the armor. If you do want to be able to calculate not only your crit cap like we talked about earlier, it's actually the same weak aura that is going to calculate your effective health pool. That's also going to be in the Discord if you want to look at that. Following up on the next important stats are hit and expertise. You need 8% hit to hit on all your specials, and then 11% hit for spells. And the way we calculate that is, you know, the spell hit cap is 17% for us. You're going to get 3% hit from virulence. That's in the unholy tree if you spec into that, and then you'll get 3% hit from the boomkin or shadow priest in your raid, which you should have one of those. That's putting the debuff on the boss. Also, expertise cap is going to be 14%, and that's to get parry capped. So you're not getting parried as much from the boss. There's always a small chance you will get parried even if you're capped. In general, you want to try to get as much hit and as much expertise as you can. But again, you do not want to sacrifice stamina or avoidance to do this. So default to stamina. If there is some hit on gear, then I would take that. Like, that's great to have. But again, item level is greater than all. Stamina is definitely more important, so don't stress out about not being hit capped or not being expertise capped. It's very hard to do starting off. I would even say you have to make some sacrifices gear-wise to be able to get hit capped and expertise capped. There are some weapons that make it easier. Don't stress out about it. It's not that important as a tank. Okay, so a couple more things. Frost Presence is always the presence we want to be in. That gives us 8% more stamina, 60% more armor. 8% reduced damage, 45% more threat. So you always want to be in Frost Presence. We never switch out of that. Just remember, if you do switch specs, that you need to re-enter a presence. It drops your presence when you switch specs. Don't be like me and swap from DPS to tanking right before patchwork and forget to put it on and grief your healers, okay? Your main priorities as a tank are, one, keeping your diseases up. So that means, you know, you start off with your Icy Touch and your Plague Strike, get your diseases up. Also maintaining Blade Barrier, and that is the 5 points that you'll have at the beginning of the blood tree, and this is activated by using your blood runes, and we'll look at that a little bit more in rotation, but this is something you want to keep track of and always keep active because it is a 5% damage reduction, and it's pretty important. And then next we're going to talk a little bit more once we get into the rotation and what your priorities are, but basically your rune management. You know, you want to make sure that you have runes when you need them. So if you need threat, you're gonna want those Frost runes for Icy Touch, or Death runes for Icy Touch. You know, if you need some healing and you took a big spike of damage, you want to build a Death Strike. If you need to refresh your diseases, you want to make sure you have a Blood rune for Pestilence. And those Blood runes and Death runes are really important because pretty much all of our defensives are going to come from that, except, you know, some of the ones that come from runic power. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about rune management, but just know you're not like a DPS where you're always just slamming through your runes. Sometimes you're going to be saving those for key moments or when you really need them. If you need threat, you're going to hit Icy Touch. If you need some heals or you need Death runes, you're going to Death Strike. Okay, let's talk about your defensive cooldowns as a Death Knight tank. Our big one is Icebound Fortitude. This reduces all damage by 30% plus additional based on your defense for 12 seconds. I think it lasts a little bit longer if you have the force-set bonus. There is a safe IBF macro in the Discord, and basically what this does is this allows you to, you know, always have the runic power for IBF. You know, if you were maybe going to accidentally dump it on a rune strike, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the rotation when we talk about the rune strike macro, but this just makes it so that you can use the rune strike macros and not have to worry about it, and you'll be able to have the runic power for IBF when you need it. Super important macro. The other big magic mitigation is your anti-magic shell. Now this is going to absorb 75% of magic dealt. This is really good on stuff like if you're main tanking Sarth and he's got that big breath, and so this is up to 50% of your maximum health, which is a lot. It will also prevent the application of harmful magical effects. So, you know, like you see if you've ever done any sort of PvP, and, you know, you'll pop this before you can get novid by a mage or things like that, you know, it negates those applications, and then you will also in return get some additional runic power. So that's also why in PvP you never want to hit a Death Knight when they have their AMS up, because they're going to get additional runic power. So that lasts 5 seconds. And then you've also got Army of the Dead. Army of the Dead is a defensive cooldown because you do get some dodge and parry when you are channeling this. So just know that if you're out of cooldowns and this is your last one up, you can actually use this as a defensive cooldown to reduce your damage. So it's actually pretty significant. Now for Blood, you're going to have 2 additional cooldowns. You're going to have Rune Tap, which I would say max this out. There's really only some niche situations and specs where you wouldn't want to max this out. So you'll go into improved Rune Tap, and then that's going to give you 20% of your maximum HP every 30 seconds, which is awesome. And you can pair it with Vampiric Blood. Vampiric Blood gives you 15% more max health, and it increases the healing done to you by 35% for 10 seconds. So that's really great to do, where you can Vamp Blood Rune Tap, or you can Vamp Blood Rune Tap Death Strike. So, and just know that you're going to be getting a lot of extra healing from that, and it's pretty short cooldown as well. If you're using one of the Frost tank specs, you will have Unbreakable Armor, and this is a 25% increase to your armor and a 20% increase to your strength. So Frost DKs will use this actually as an offensive cooldown, but for you it's going to be a defensive cooldown. Quickly about some consumables. You've got a lot of options as far as food depending on what you want. You could use Blackened Dragonfin as like a defense food. You get a little bit of dodge from the agility. If you need expertise, you can do the Worm Steak. If you need some hit, you can do the Snapper Extreme. There's also some different versions of these. There's usually like a meat version and a fish version. For Flask, we're going to use Flask of Stoneblood, and then for potions, we're going to be using Indestructible Potions. So this will be your pre-pot, and then you'll keep this running throughout the fight if you have a fight that lasts longer than 2 minutes. I like to use for food the Dragon Fin Fillet. That gives 40 strength, so you get a little bit more parry, and then you get some AP from that. And then you also can use the Fish Feast, totally fine. Really the big part of the food is the stamina. That's really what we care about. And then the other one's just kind of a bonus, the other stat. So that's kind of what I generally like to do for food. Okay, now let's talk about some different talents and glyphs and the options you have. So this is your standard blood single target mitigation, and this is really best for main tanking bosses in a raid scenario. So it's a 43, 23, 5. It does pick up two-hand weapon mastery, so those points are swappable if you are dual wielding. You could put those into bloody strikes, you know, or maybe put some extra points into scent of blood. I usually only put 1 point into scent of blood, but there's some flexibility there if you want to add those, move those points around if you're not using a two-hander. It's got frigid dread plate out of the frost tree, giving you that extra avoidance, and of course the 5% dodge from unholy. And then glyphs for this, it's pretty standard. Your glyph of disease is pretty much mandatory. That's where you're going to use to refresh your diseases. Once they're up, you'll be using pestilence. Glyph of dark command, I would say that's kind of more of the flex glyph. It is nice to have that extra 8% hit on your taunt. That makes sure that your kind of taunt doesn't miss, and it's going to be spell hit capped, probably pretty close depending on where your hit's at. And then you've got Glyph of Vampiric Blood, which is nice, just adds a little bit more duration to your Vamp Blood. And then for minor glyphs, you have Glyph of Blood Tap, and that just removes the damage from Blood Tap, which was pretty minimal to begin with, not really that important. Glyph of Raised Dead is just a quality of life where you don't have to have the corpse dust reagent to raise your ghoul. And then Glyph of Pestilence, I'd say that one's a little bit more mandatory. I mean, it's just really nice to have that extra range on Pestilence. Again, as tanking, you're usually pretty much, you know, you're right up there up front in the boss's crotch, you know, or you're in the mix for AoE packs. So, but it is nice to have that extra radius, and there really aren't many good options for the minor glyphs. So these are pretty much our best options. Next, we'll look at a blood AoE spec, and this is a 43-28, and this is just, again, just a blood spec that's more AoE focused. So you'll see we pick up more ability in the unholy tree to have those death and decays coming out a lot faster. We do lose the frigid dread plate in the frost tree, so a little bit less avoidance there. And you'll see we've got the swap to bloody strikes instead of two-hand weapon mastery. And but that's pretty much it. It's kind of similar to the other spec. Again, you'll see a lot of these follow the same template because there's just some key talents that we want to kind of make sure that we have in each of these specs. But again, change them based on what you're seeing, what your needs are. If you need virulence for that extra hit, whatever you need to do, you can always do that. If you're like, hey, I don't really need 5% dodge, you can make that swap. Okay, for glyphs for this, again, Glyph of Pestilence. I like to use Glyph of Death and Decay since, again, we're more AoE focused on this. Let's get that extra damage on Death and Decay, and then Glyph of Vamp Blood, and then the rest of the glyphs are the same. This is your double buff build for Blood, and essentially what this does is it gives you Icy Talons out of the Frost Tree, and it gives you A-Bomb's Might out of the Blood Tree, which we already have with the other specs. This is pretty much only useful if the Enhanced Shamans want to drop their improved haste talents, or you don't have another Frost DK that can pick that up. So basically, maybe if you're in a 10-man raid scenario with no Frost DK or Enhanced Shaman, or any other scenario where you need to bring that double buff, it's nice to be able to have. Again, you have points in two-hand weapon mastery, so if you're using one-handers with blood, which we'll talk about the one-hander, two-hander thing a little bit later, you can swap those points into bloody strikes, and you can take a point out of the bloody vengeance, put it into the bloody strikes. Okay, for glyphs, again, very similar. I would just run Glyph of Disease, Glyph of Dark Command, and Glyph of Vamp Blood. Minors are the same. Okay, this is your blood damage spec. This is if you want to bang.
I do. Let me bang. I do let you bang. Hey. Let me bang again, man. I let you bang. I let you bang. Let you bang. Let you bang.
I told you I'd let you bang. This is how you bang. It is going to be more damage, so yeah, if you needed to do more damage, you can make a case for this spec, but really this is just going to be probably for parsing, let's be honest. You're not really griefing much. You are losing the 5% dodge, you are losing the frigid dread plate, you're putting a lot more talents into blood to do more damage, so you got Heart Strike, you got Might of Mograine, things like that. Again, two-hand weapon mastery if you're using one-handers, you can swap, but if you're going to be doing this spec, you would probably want to use a two-hander anyway, so that's what I would recommend for that. And then as far as talents, I would use Glyph of Disease, again, for refreshing. Glyph of Death Strike's going to do a lot of good damage, and Glyph of Dancing Rune Weapon, so you get that extra time in Dancing Rune Weapon. Minors stay the same. Okay, this is the Frost off-tank spec. It's 1254.5. So really the only thing you're losing from the blood tree is you're losing the Vamp Blood, you're losing Wold and Necropolis, and then you're losing that improved rune tap, which I was talking about earlier. So you only have that 1 point rune tap. I'm not a big fan of just regular rune tap without improved rune tap, but you can run that in the spec. You can put the point somewhere else. There's aren't a whole lot of good options for it, so you can pick up rune tap for that extra little heal. But basically this is kind of your obliterate off tank, doing a little bit more damage as Frost. Doesn't quite have the as much avoidance, but it will do better damage. You also have Threat of Thessarian, so it's more of a dual wield. So if you were going to be using a two-hander, I would put those points probably into Frigid Dreadplate so you'd have extra avoidance. So again, you're going to do better damage. You'll do a little bit more AoE because you got those big Howling Blasts. But this is kind of what you would do for kind of like a standard Frost off tank. So you've got, again, Glyph of Disease. You're going to be doing that same sort of refreshing your diseases with Pestilence, and then you'd run Glyph of Frost Strike, and then you've got Glyph of Howling Blast and Glyph of Obliterate. Honestly, those three glyphs can be flexed around. I prefer Glyph of Howling Blast personally because it just throws Frost Fever up on everything. Glyph of Obliterate's good if you find yourself where you're kind of off tanking. You want to be doing more damage, and you want those. You're going to be obliterating instead of death striking. You want to hit those big obliterates. I think you can do that. Yeah, same with Glyph of Frost Strike. That's just more damage. So if you were trying to focus more on doing damage as an off tank, again, I would probably just have dual spec and have a straight up DPS spec. That's kind of what I do. But if you're trying to make two things happen with one spec, this is kind of the one to do it with. Personally, I don't like doing that. I like having a straight tank spec and a straight DPS spec, but this is kind of what this spec is trying to do, is do more damage as a Frost off tank that kind of is just, taunting here and there and DPSing on the side. Okay, this is the Frost AoE build. I much prefer this. Again, I prefer pure tanking builds and pure DPS builds personally. I don't really like the hybrids. I feel like if you're performing a role, perform that role to the best of your ability, and don't worry about trying to do two roles at once because you're typically not going to be doing them optimally anyway. So this is the Frost AoE. Talents are 1053-8. We take bladed armor and blade barrier out of the blood tree. Those are kind of the important ones there. And then we go deep into Frost, and you'll notice no annihilation, no rhyme, because we're not obliterating at all. And then in Unholy, you've got Morb, you got Virulence. You could swap those around. You could put 5 points into Dodge if you wanted 5% Dodge and a little bit more avoidance. But it does have Frigid Dreadplate in the Frost tree, so it does have that. And it's got kind of all the good stuff. You will notice that there are no dual wield talents in this, so you can do this with a two-hander. You can do this with one-handers. Works well with both. So less single target, but a lot more AoE. And then for glyphs for this, I would recommend Glyph of Disease, Glyph of Death and Decay, and Glyph of Howling Blast. So you're going to be doing a lot of AoE with the Death and Decay and Howling Blast. And then minors are the same. Okay, let's talk about your rotations. So your blood tank rotations, pre-pull, you're going to Horn of Winter. 10 seconds before the pull, you can drop your Death and Decay, and then all your runes will be back up. You're going to pre-pot with an indestructible potion just before the pull, and then I would just pop this on cooldown, keep it rolling throughout the fight. You can also, as an option, get your Blade Barrier up early. You can cast 2 Blood Boils, or if you're already doing a Death and Decay, you can pop a Blood Boil. That's going to start your Blade Barrier. This is really good for, things like Patchwork, where he's just going to be like slapping pretty hard right off the bat. You can already have that 5% damage reduction going off of the rip, which is really nice. Okay, this is what your single target opener is going to look like. You're going to Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Death Strike. You'll Blood Tap, get another Icy Touch out, Blood Strike, Empowering Rune Weapon, Pestilence to refresh your diseases, and then Icy Touch, Death Strike. From here, you can see what's going to happen and then decide where you need to use your runes best. Do you need to use a defensive? Do you need to heal? Do you need to pump more threat? Things like that. You can also Death Grip right off the rip before you start your rotation, just to get a little bit added threat. Okay, so here is your AoE rotation as a blood tank. You're going to go Death and Decay, Ice Touch, Plague Strike, Pestilence, Blood Boil. So you can see it takes about 5 globals before you're actually really getting some AoE, some solid AoE threat going. So It's a little more challenging as blood. That's why I really don't prefer this in dungeons. We'll talk about different scenarios and different specs you want to use in those scenarios a little bit later. But your threat opener is going to have a lot of icy touches. So it's going to be icy touch, blood tap, icy touch. Empowering rune weapon, icy touch, icy touch, plague strike, blood strike, and from there you can either kind of go into a normal rotation or kind of see what's happening and then decide where you want to spend your runes. As you're following through after your opener with your rotations, you want to be refreshing your diseases with pestilence. Your main rune dump, what you're going to be spending your runic power on, is rune strike, and there's helpful macros for that to where you don't even really have to think about it. Again, I think macroing rune strike is fine as long as you have the kind of safe macros for like IBF and some other things. Yeah, you can ghoul sack and things like that and create macros for that can make it safe. If you're interested in looking at those macros, you can go into the Discord and find all that information. But macroing rune strike into key abilities is totally fine. You want rune strike hidden because it's gonna add to your threat substantially. And then you're basically going to be using Death Strike to heal and activate death runes, so that way you can use those runes where you need to. Okay, here's the Frost Tank rotation. So you're going to start with Death and Decay, you'll Howling Blast, you'll Blood Boil, Howling Blast, Death and Decay. That's kind of your basic. It's almost like a Morb, similar to the Unholy Death Knights. It's going to feel a lot more like that type of rotation. This will only work if you do have Morb. If you don't have Morb in your Frost Tank spec, then you would lean more of a standard rotation. So instead of Howling Blast, you'd probably Death and Decay, maybe a Howling Blast, a Blood Boil, and then you'd probably would like Plague Strike and do that. You can also Plague Strike with this at this point if you, let's say you really needed to get a Death Strike out because you would want both diseases up for that. This will only work with the Glyph of Howling Blast, but this is pretty much what I do in dungeons. Like if you just do that rotation on big pulls, like everything's going to be stuck to you. Again, your follow through would be refresh diseases with Pestilence, use runic power on your rune strike, and then if you have any additional, you would use it on frost strike. For the frost tank off tank spec, you would use obliterate for extra threat or damage. So again, just know that Howling Blast will apply frost fever if it is glyphed, but in general you are going to want to, in a raid scenario, you're going to want to plague strike to add that blood plague as well, because you want both diseases rolling on the target. This rotation is more of something I use in dungeons, so in a raid scenario I would be plague striking and making sure diseases are up. Okay, let's talk about the best specs for raid tanking. For main tanking raids, the blood single target spec is gonna be the best bang for your buck there. You've got all those big powerful cooldowns, you get the big juicy death strikes that are gonna heal a ton, and that's pretty much the way to go. It really suffers in AoE situations, so you can either swap to DPS while you're clearing trash or just kind of rely on one of the other tanks to really kind of pick things up. You can kind of pick things up that run off, but just know that this isn't going to do very well in the AoE scenarios. As far as off tanking, if you're more of playing that off tank, then the blood AoE spec should be fine. The frost off tank spec should be fine. The frost AoE spec will be totally fine. I've taken hatefuls, I think, in all of these specs. I think I've main tanked in all of these specs. So just with where we're at with the difficulty level of content or lack of difficulty, any of these specs should be fine. I would just pick one that is the best for the role that you are playing in the raid. If you need more AoE and snap threat, then maybe go with the frost AoE spec. If you're need to do a little bit more of the main tanking, then I would go with the single target blood. And then if you're kind of doing a combination of both and you like to have the D&D to drop for the AoE packs, then you can do the blood AoE. You have all of the tools that you need for single tanking in those specs as well. Just know that kind of based on the talents, what you're going to be missing, because you know what's in those talent trees. So you'll know, hey, I got a little bit less avoidance, but I have a little bit more AoE, or, I have a little bit less single target, but I have more AoE. So just know, like, hey, if you need to just pump single target, you go single target, If you need a little bit of the AoE, then you go for that. For 10-man raids, if you have no Frost DK or Enhanced Shaman, you can do the blood double buff. That would be totally fine in that scenario. And then, of course, if you just want to do some damage and parse, you can just go the blood damage. Again, you pretty much have all of the tools that you need to be successful raid tanking in any of these specs. It really is just going to come down to kind of where you're at with healers and a preference, and again, choosing the spec that works best for you based on the scenarios that you're finding yourself in as a tank. Okay, let's talk about heroic dungeon tanking. So for heroic tanking, I really prefer the Frost AoE spec. I'm a blood enjoyer at heart, so I really tried to make the blood AoE spec work, and it does kind of work, but there are just times where I would lose aggro to like these big pumpers and just really didn't like that. I don't like losing aggro as a tank. So with the Frost AoE spec and that rotation I mentioned earlier, dropping, you know, you go D&D, Howling Blast, Blood Boil, Howling Blast, D&D, everything is stuck to you, nothing's leaving, and it works really well. So that's my recommended spec for dungeon tanking. Okay, let's talk about some final tips and a couple more things, and then we'll talk about one-handed versus two-handed weapons. So number one is rune management. Unlike a DPS, you want to be saving your runes. You don't want to be keeping them on cooldown. You want to save them for, you know, when you need them, like key transitions, like I think like Noth teleports, when you might want to taunt and then Icy Touch and get some snap threat. You might need some runes for death strikes when you get some big damage spikes. So you kind of want to save runes to use them reactively to the situation that you're currently in. Do you need to pop a cooldown? You need a rune for that, you know? So that's kind of how you want to be managing that, you know, making sure you have runes for when you need it, like keeping your diseases up and refreshing them with pestilence, and knowing when you're going to be taking big damage and you're going to want to react to those. So again, always have some runes for when you need it. Number two would be using your cooldowns preemptively or being a little bit proactive. So almost the opposite of your runes, you're saving them. You want to be using your defensive cooldowns a little bit, I would say, before things happen. And a good way to practice this is to do some PvP. So some examples would be popping IBF before a rogue can stun you. Right? If you pop, you actually can't pop IBF while you're stunned, so but you can pop it before you know a stun is coming, and then you wouldn't get stunned. So very similar to in a PvE scenario where you know big damage is coming, pop your IBF first, so that way you get that reduction on the big hit, not like you get a big damage spike and you're at 50% and then you hit IBF. Well, that IBF really isn't helping you at that point. You would want to use more of your reactive things like, you know, Death Strike, things like that. So IBF and AMS, you want to use those again preemptively. Like AMS can prevent you from magical effects to being applied to you. So you would want to use that, you know, before, again, like a Frost Mage would Nova you or something like that, or another DK would chains you. You know, if you've ever dueled other DKs, you'll see like AMS is usually the first thing that comes out because we don't want diseases applied. So just think about using those cooldowns a little bit preemptively before the damage comes in. Let's talk a little bit about kind of like how you're going to be gearing. Do you want to go full effective health pool, which is like your stamina and your armor? Do you want to go full avoidance, which is like dodge and parry? Do you want to go full threat, where I don't know, you're gemming strength or something? You definitely want to balance between all of these, is my opinion. I lean more towards effective health. As a Death Knight, I think it's nice to have a big, beefy health pool. We're kind of the soak tank in the game, which means like we have a large health pool and we're soaking damage with our health pool, rather than a mitigation tank, which is more like a warrior or a paladin, and they're mitigating a lot of damage with their block and their armor. So we are mitigating some, we are avoiding some, but we're mainly soaking, similar to a bear tank, where they also have a large health pool, they're mitigating some with their armor, and then they're soaking a lot with their big health pool. So I like health pool because we get more healing from our death strikes. All of our abilities are percent based off of our health in general, you know, things like vampiric blood. So all of those things just benefit from the high health pool. But again, you don't want to neglect your avoidance, and I don't really think there's any point to trying to gear towards threat, because threat just happens. Icy Touch is insane, and we just do so much threat, it's just not even an issue. So as you're looking at your gear, I would say don't neglect those things, but I just want to talk about a little bit of like, you know, when you're gearing, what your options are and which direction you might want to go. Okay, let's talk about one-handed versus two-handed weapons. Weapons are stat sticks, okay? And I know I've said this before, and it's been said before by many people. One-handers can be better for frost because you have talents that buff that, like Threat of Thessarian. You can get the extra hit and the extra offhand damage. And then two-handers can be better for blood because, again, you have the two-hand weapon master, you get that extra damage. But really, it's really not that significant as a tank. So in general, the one-handers are really nice because they've got a lot of those defensive stats and tanking stats that we like. They've got hit on them. But there are some nice two-handers out there as well that have some nice stats on them that we can use. So usually you're just going to use the best weapons you have. That's my recommendation, is use the best weapons you have. Now, that being said, let's talk about parry hasting, because really the only reason one-handers wouldn't be as good as two-handers is because of parry hasting. So essentially what that is if a boss parries your attack, they land their next attack faster. There's a bunch of math to this, to like the swing timer and when it happens, if it's going to be 40% faster or if it's going to finish 20% faster. It's really not that important, but just know that using one-hand weapons means you're going to be parried more, which means the boss is going to attack faster, which really means you're going to be taking more damage. So with one-hand weapons in general, you're going to be taking a little bit more damage. With two-hand weapons in general, you're going to be taking a little bit less damage because you're going to be getting parried less. Now, does that really matter right now? A couple things. For one, it's actually a bug because most of the bosses are not supposed to parry haste. There was only, I think, a couple bosses that were supposed to. Generally, the dragons do, so that would be Sarth and Sephiron. So maybe Malagos was supposed to, but right now everything is parry hasting, and it really doesn't matter. Okay, like the damage is pretty insignificant at this point. This might matter later on. This might matter even in Phase 2 in Ulduar with hard modes. So if you're watching this as a later date, right now it's Phase 1, this might be more important. But right now, it is not critical, so don't stress out about weapons. Use the best ones you have. Look at the stats, look at what you want, and go with that. And then just cater your talents around the weapons you have. That's my recommendations with weapons. So if you're interested in more Death Knight tanking tips, you can check out the Blood Death Knight Tank class guide on Wowhead. It is very exhaustive. It has tons of information. It's got tons of math. So if you want to nerd out on all of that stuff, you can totally go there and get more details and find out a little bit more behind kind of the numbers behind things. That's where you'll want to look. You can also join my Discord if you want to see the macros and setups that I use. And then you can also, come ask questions. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you so much for the support. If you would like to, you can follow me on Twitch and you can come ask me questions there if you have any questions about any of this. You can also join the Discord, ask me some questions there. Hope this helps you out. Hope this helps you achieve your goals in game as far as tanking on a Death Knight. And I hope you get those bosses real mad at you and that you don't die. And of course...
That's too soft. No.